Hello, in this video I'm going to introduce the concept of modulation. Now we are going to have to take this concept, these concepts really about modulation, we're going to have to unpack them a little bit in class. So this is really a whirlwind introduction to modulation, where I'll go through a few concepts. You can rewind the video, see if you can pick up a little bit more. You might have to watch this in short segments, really make sure you understand each part, and bring questions to class, and we'll see what we can figure out when we get to class if you have any questions. Certainly we'll be doing exercises in class. It will help to solidify the information here. But this is just to give you a ballpark idea, to get you in the thinking in the right direction when it comes to modulation. What do we mean by modulation? Modulation is the process of changing key. You establish one key very firmly, then there is a point of modulation, and then you move on from after that point of modulation, you move off in a new key. This is a very common part of common practice harmony. In fact, it's one of the things in common practice harmony that is foundational to the way that music is structured and formal designs are created. And we'll look more at that when we get into structural forms down the road. But right now we do need to understand that A, you can be in a key, and B, that there can be a point of modulation that helps you to transition, to modulate into a new key. Now that point of modulation can be one chord, or it can be a series of chords, a sequence of chords, a period of time, many measures in which you are transitioning and modulating into the new key. But there is usually a clearly, firmly established key center on the one hand, in the first place. Then there is usually a point of modulation, as I say, maybe very specific, or maybe a period of time where the music is not really in any key, or is running back and forth between a couple of keys. And then there is a clear establishing of a new key right after the modulation, so that we know where we now are in the new key. And then we're in that for a while, and we might modulate again, and so on. Well, there are a variety of different ways that you can modulate, and this is going to be this, as I say, a kind of a whirlwind introduction to some of the different ways that you can modulate. We're not going to deal with the last two. I'll mention them, but we're not really going to deal with them in any kind of detail. And even the top three, we're really going to be looking at pretty quickly here. So the first thing is to say about modulation is there is almost always there is something in common between the two keys. You can have a direct modulation where the old key just ends and a new key just begins, but that is honestly quite rare. It can happen, it is quite rare. More often there is something in common between the old key and the new key. There's something that links or connects the two, and sometimes that can just be even just a note. There can be a common tone, again the word tone here being used really synonymous with the word note. So there can be a common tone or a common note in common. And if we look, for example, at these two chords, let's imagine that we were in G major, very firmly in G major, and this side of the music, and that after this we're going to be in E flat major going on. Well, those two keys they're not really commonly or closely related. In class we'll talk about closely related keys and distantly related keys. What do we mean by that? But for now, let's just accept that we are in G major here and we're going on into E flat major. How do we connect those two keys? What was in common between those two keys? Well, it's possible that just this note G would be enough. That maybe the composer would finish on the G chord, and then maybe sustain the note G, and then start the next section on an E flat chord, and be in E flat major from there on out. And certainly that might happen, and if it did, then what you essentially have is a common note between the two keys, and that would be a common tone or a common note modulation, with just one note in common between the two keys. Another way that you can modulate would be to have a common chord, have a whole chord in common. Now for this to happen, the chord has to physically exist in both keys. That means there has to be you have to be able to identify one chord in one key and that same chord in another key. I'll show you what I mean. It's almost easier to show you an illustration. Let's say that we came up with this series of chords and that we realized that when we started here we were clearly in C major. This first section here establishes that quite well. and that by the time we get to the end, we seem to be clearly in G major. The chords at the end here make more sense in G major. They don't really make sense in C major. This would have to be a secondary dominant if we were in C major still. And assuming the piece carries on clearly in G major, then perhaps we have modulated. So perhaps we have chords in the between here, while all these chords could be described as being in C major, really right up to this point. This is the first chord where you're not really in C major. We could argue that the modulation has taken place earlier on through a chord in common between the two keys. But I have to say, is there one point of modulation here? But we'll look at that in a moment. If we go ahead with saying, yes, there's one point of modulation, let's put some chords up. This would be a 1 chord, going to a 5 chord, to a 1 chord, to a 5 chord. Here we have an E minor chord. In this key it would be a 3 chord. Then we get to a 6 chord. Now, if we're going to interpret this from here on out as being in G, then in G that's our 1 chord, that's our 5 chord, and the C now becomes a 4 chord in G. So, what is A minor in G? Well, it is a 2 chord. So we might be able to say, up until this point we're clearly in C major, then the A minor chord is a pivot chord. It is a chord that exists in both the old key and the new key. And at that point we kind of pivot down, and now we analyze everything in the new key of G major. We are in G major from this point on. Now some of you might be looking at this and saying, well, can't you just say that here? Can't you say that the E minor is a 3 chord in the old key, but in G it's a 6 chord, so 3 becomes 6? Or couldn't you just wait till here and say the C is a 1 chord in the old key and it becomes a 4 chord in the new key? Or couldn't we do it here, say that this G is a 5 chord in the old key and a 1 chord in the new key? The answer is yes. That's what I mean by the fact that a modulation is very hard to nail down sometimes. You can't necessarily say this is the point of modulation. You can say this piece from here is clearly in C, here is clearly in G, and somewhere in here it modulates. But it could be modulating over a period of time, over a number of measures, through a number of chords, rather than necessarily nailing it down to one place. And understanding that modulation takes place over time with things in common. These things are in common to both these. These keys are closely related, they have a lot in common. You overlap the things that are in common, and then you can kind of sidestep into the new key, and you don't even notice it sometimes. You have to be listening really well to kind of pick up that a modulation has taken place. So, that would be common chord modulation. Another way of modulating is extended common chord modulation. Common chord extended. This would be where you have essentially a secondary dominant in common between the two keys. Let's look at this. In this case we've got, again, C major at the beginning and G major at the end. But one could interpret this as 1, 5, 7, 1 here, and then get to 4. When you get here, if we are indeed still in C major, then you have to interpret that chord as a 5-7 of 5. That's the only way D, F sharp, A, C makes sense in C major, as a 5-7 of 5. But if indeed that is the point of modulation, because these other chords don't necessarily have the F chord, for example, really is a C major chord. You really don't find an F chord in G. So we really don't have a sense of being in G until we reach this chord. So if this is indeed the first time that we really know we're going to a new key, then we have to use this as our point of modulation. So what we say is 5-7 of 5 in the old key becomes 5-7 in the new key. Then you can go on there analyzing everything in G major. That becomes a 1 chord, E minor now is a 6 chord, 4, 5, 1. And we've got a modulation that takes place through an extended common chord. Yes, this D is not really in common in that it doesn't actually exist in C, but it can be justified in C major. And as it's justified in C major as a 5-7 of 5, it can become a point of connection with the new key as a 5-7 chord, and it can lead us into the new key. So this kind of extended common chord where you have, again, a point of commonality, a point of connection, but it's a little bit more removed from having exact chords that are described exactly the same way and fit in both keys. Okay, So that's common chord and extended common chord modulation, and we covered common tone. Sequential modulation is where you have a sequence of chords related to one another, usually with a common interval distance, and you're stepping up or down as you go by this common interval. Perhaps stepping down a fifth and up a second, and down a fifth and up a second, down a fifth and up a second. You do this continually, and you set up a chain going where you are in a sequence, is what it is called, where you probably have a melodic or harmonic fragment that is moving in a set interval distance, up or down, through keys. And as you change key to key to key to key, you can basically use it like a stairway. You wait till you get to the key you want to be in, and you just step off of the elevator, and then you start off in that new key. So sequential modulation is a way that you can modulate using a sequence. We'll talk more about that and look at examples of that in class. And then enharmonic modulation. This is a much more advanced way of modulating. This is where you respell something enharmonically in one key, and then you respell it so that enharmonically it is something in the next key. You haven't actually physically changed any of the notes, but you're thinking of it differently. And we will look at some examples of that in class as well. That is a lot more tricky. That potentially you can go further. You can get to many more remote places from one key to keys that are a long way away, distantly related keys. You can get there through using enharmonic modulation, but it plays with your brain a little bit. So we'll look at that in class and kind of take that slowly and see if we can figure out a few things to do with enharmonic modulation in class. These are the ones I really want you aware of, but more important even than that, I want you aware that there is a way to change key, that changing key is a part of the common practice period, and that there is often something in common between the two keys and a period of time in which you are kind of in both keys, where things can be justified two ways, shown here by the bracket, which could be extended over a number of chords, where you would have a number of chords in common, or a number of measures of music in common. And modulation is a process, it's something that happens over time, with something in common between the two keys. Sometimes it can be nailed down to one point, more often it is something that happens over time in a number of measures. If you get those concepts in your head, then we'll be in good shape to kind of unpack this a little bit and talk about it a little bit more, and even incorporate some of this into your own progressions now, and into some of your own construction of music in the common practice style. Thank you.